It's Shorty September. Here's some nonfiction recommendations. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a video in which I'm going to recommend a few books. I didn't count them for Shorty September, and these are all nonfiction reads. A lot of them are actually works of history, some centering on the United States, some centering in Europe in the medieval, Renaissance, Enlightenment period. Just some really good, I thought, short books that you could read for Shorty September if you had your fill of reading short novels. So I want to go through these essentially, I think, in chronological order as they would exist. No, that's not true. But I'm going to go through these in terms of thematically. So the first book on my list is The Revolutionary War, or The American Revolution, A History by Gordon S. Wood. Wood is a renowned, well-respected historian in the United States of America. This is a really short book which kind of just talks about a lot of the issues that led to, or a lot of the issues that then existed in what will become the United States during the American Revolution. I think it comes in just to right around 200 pages. Nope, not even that. Around 160 pages of readable text. The print is really small, but a good short book. And if you've never read anything about the American Revolution, this might be a good place to start. It might be a little academic, but I do think it's a good book and a good place to start. Also, was it this year or last year, I read Never Caught, The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. This book is, as the subtitle suggests, is a story of an enslaved woman who ran away from George Washington while he was in Philadelphia, acting as President of the United States, I believe, and ran away and escaped, and his attempt to get her back. Which really was fairly relentless throughout her life. Just a really good, I think, look at taking one specific case involving American slavery and the founding fathers, and going back and looking at that case as an example of how slavery worked. Now, technically, the book itself is 202 pages. There are interviews with Ona Judge and other material at the back of the book would make it a little longer. But it really is good. I think almost any level reader could read this. I know there's a version of this that was written for kids. Next on my list are two books about the Civil War that are remarkably similar. First is Why the North Won the Civil War, and the second is Why the Confederacy Lost the Civil War. So if you know the basics of the American Civil War, and you know kind of maybe why the Civil War happened, or what happened in the Civil War, or who won, these books are good because they contain individual essays looking at issues that gave either the North an advantage or put the South at a disadvantage. So this book probably covers more well-known ground about why the North won. It talks about their economic advantages and military advantages, the advantages they had in terms of diplomacy and dealing with other countries, how the American system, democracy, created by the Constitution, was superior to the Confederacy for fighting a war. And this book looks at kind of the other side of that, which is what about the South may cause them to lose, or what kind of things cause them to lose. One of my favorite pieces of writing, and I think one of the most influential pieces of writing for me, is an essay in here by the historian Joseph T. Glather, and it's called Black Glory, the African American Role in Union Victory, which talks about the important role played by black soldiers who fought on the Union side, and how that in some ways tipped the balance, or tipped the scale even further in favor of the North. But both those books are good for looking at kind of the why of the way the Civil War worked out. And I think it's all well and good to know what happened, but I think knowing why something happened is far more important in terms of historical understanding. And the why is a whole lot harder to Google and to look up. Both those books are excellent. The next few books have to do with issues surrounding race relations in the United States and other social issues. The first is Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela White Davis. This is Davis looking at the prison industrial complex, the purpose of prisons, how prisons have changed, how prisons are failing, and if prisons are necessary. It is a really good book, really one of those books that's going to make you think about something on almost every single page, and it's just over 100 pages long. Probably wouldn't be surprised to see Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is a book essentially where Coates is talking about and I think exposing and illustrating in lots of ways the struggles that black men face in the United States, and the way in which the world views them, the way in which they view one another, the pressures they might put on themselves, the problems they might have growing up. In some ways it's written for his sons, and on a very similar note is Breathe, A Letter to My Sons by historian Imani Perry, in which she talks about, again, kind of the history of her family, teaching that, preserving that for her sons, the good and the bad, the heroic and the tragic, and kind of trying to make her sons aware of what she would like them to be in the world, and how she would like them to carry forward, I think, the legacy tradition she sees in her family. And then a book I've mentioned many times, and that's On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon Reed. This is a series of essays from Gordon Reed, who was the author of The Jefferson's Monticello, really monumental work of history and Jefferson's relation to slavery. And this kind of talks about her own personal history as integrating a school in Conroe, Texas, and then how Juneteenth worked, and all those how Juneteenth happened here in Texas and its meaning here, and how that became a national holiday from here. Just a really excellent short book. And I think on a completely different note, I also really enjoyed The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels, which basically goes through well, not books of the Bible, because they were never included in the Bible, but writings of a group of Christians known as the Gnostics, which in some ways don't stick with what we think of as biblical tradition, that are very different in their outlooks. Now, I don't believe the Gnostic Gospels exist in whole or completely, so oftentimes there are fragments, but just a really interesting book. If you're interested in religious history, the history of Christianity, the evolution of Christianity, and the Bible, I think the Gnostic Gospels is a great place to start, something I wish I'd read more of. The next few books are about European history in one way or another. The first is really a groundbreaking book, and excuse my incredibly old copy, called Medieval People by the historian Eileen Power. And in this book, we begin to see Power, who I believe was writing in the early 30s, 40s, kind of making a case for looking at history through the lives of everyday people, and particularly kind of how the economic situation of everyday people affected their lives. So there are, stories here about people who are well known and people who are less well known, how peasants' lives worked, etc. And it was really something new when it was first published back in whenever it was. But it is a classic work of European history. It says first published in 1924, and I think the writing is good and the story's told good, and it feels a lot more modern than that 1924 date might suggest. Along the same lines, I also have this book called The Cheese and the Worms by Carlo Ginzburg, which really looks at how science and the Catholic Church oftentimes butt at heads with one another. It looks at a man named Minocchio, who was just basically a regular person living a regular life, and he had a family, had kids. I think he was a farmer, and how he began becoming obsessed with cosmology, with the study of the stars and the movement of planets, and how that caused him to run afoul of the Christian church. So it gives you kind of insights into everyday life while also kind of exploring this other issue, and it's right around 130 pages. Also, I have Brunelleschi's Dome by Ross King, which is a story of how the first dome building was created in Renaissance Florence. The first dome building since Roman antiquity was created in Renaissance Florence. And it's a really fascinating story, but it's also a story of how it's not really necessarily a dome, but it's a really interesting story about how that process, or about how architects competed for the right to be the one who built the dome, how that process carried on, how the dome was created. If you're interested in that kind of thing, it's good. Along the same lines, maybe, of architecture and engineering, there is the book One Good Turn, a natural history of the screwdriver and the screw by Witold Rybczynski, who I had read a book by Rybczynski about called Clearing the Distance, about the landscape architect guy whose name is just left my head. But anyway, it's a really good book about how important that screw is, and the screwdriver, and all the different uses of it, and when it first came into use, and who kind of came up with the idea of the screw, and all the different ways that it had been used to kind of advance Western civilization. And also kind of close to that, I think, is Longitude, the true story of the lone genius who saved the greatest solved the greatest scientific problem of his time, and that's the story of how this fellow named Mitchell basically came up with measuring longitude by time, and to do that he had to develop a clock which could function well at sea, which meant that it did well in, you know, the kind of wet, salty atmosphere of being on a sailing ship at sea. They could deal with the rolling of the ship, and at the same time it kept accurate time. Solving this longitude problem was one of the biggest problems that existed in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. And figuring out that the way to do it was to measure distance by time, measure east to west distance, west to east different distance by time was incredibly important. And the reason why the prime meridian runs through Greenwich is because Greenwich is in England, and the guy who solved the problem was English. And then finally, something completely different. One of the only memoirs I've read that I really enjoyed, or really was moved by, was Dear Friend, From My Life I Write to You in Your Life by Yi-Yun Lee, who wrote the Book of Goose, I believe, her most recent work of fiction, and is a Chinese writer living in the United States now who suffered from real depression. And this is kind of in some ways how books kind of got her out of that, and how a writing relationship with the Irish writer William Trevor helped her pull herself out of that, and her experience in mental health situations during the time period. I just thought a really kind of deep and at the same time very moving book. Anyway, there you go. There are some nonfiction selections for Shorty September. If you've read any of these, have any ideas about any of these, anything else you want to say, please leave that in the comments in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching.